How much of the world's food production is dependent on pollinators? The populations of many pollinator insects like bees, wasps, and butterflies are in decline. Many crops rely on pollinators, which raises concerns about the future of our food. 3/4 of our crops depend on pollinators to some extent, but only 1/3 of global crop production does. Crops, staples such as cereals, are not dependent on them at all. Most would see a decline in yields if pollinator insects disappeared. Studies suggest that crop production would decline by around 5% in higher income countries, and 8% at low to middle incomes, if pollinator insects vanished. Unfortunately, the wildlife we care least about provides us with the most functional value. We favor the bears over the insects and bacteria, despite relying on the latter much more. We might associate crop pollination with honeybees. Still, a range of studies has shown that non-bee pollinators, such as butterflies, beetles, and hoverflies, also play an essential role in pollinating fruits, vegetables, and oil crops. Many people worry about the stability of our food systems, as more studies suggest that the world's pollinator insects are disappearing. Many recent studies report a decline in insect populations in different regions. It is not the case everywhere. Some species are stable, and some have increased, but most show an overall decline. A study in the Netherlands reported that average butterfly populations had almost halved since 1991. The European Environment Agency measured changes in grassland butterfly populations across 17 species and 17 countries. Since 1991, average populations have declined by around 25%. The same is true of bumblebees. Numerous studies across Europe and North America show that, while some populations remain stable, or are even growing, many bee populations have seen a steep decline. Ecosystems are changing the most rapidly across the tropics. We have very little data on how pollinator insects are changing. They could be doing even worse. Pollinator insects face multiple threats. One is simply habitat loss. The area they can live in shrinks as human land use for farming and infrastructure expands. Another is climatic changes. They can be particularly vulnerable to intense drought. A single year of extreme drought in the UK in 1976 resulted in a dramatic decline in butterfly populations. Populations of some butterfly species fell by 76%. There are also threats on agricultural lands when we use pesticides and fertilizers to increase crop yields. This presents us with a dilemma. Some of the ways we can increase food production might also put it at risk. That raises an important question: how dependent are we on pollinators? What would happen if pollinators declined dramatically, or worse, if they disappeared? There are two things that are important to clarify. First, not all crops are dependent on pollinators. Many of our staples are completely unaffected by them. Second, if a crop is defined as being pollinator dependent, this does not necessarily mean that it would fail without them. In fact, there are only a couple of crops where pollinator insects are essential. For all others, a decline in pollinators would result in a decline in yields. Most of our staple crops, cereals such as maize, wheat, and rice, roots and tubers such as cassava, and legumes such as peas and lentils, do not rely on bees and butterflies at all. A lot of our fruits and vegetables, oil crops, coffee, nuts, and avocados are partially dependent. There are only a few crops that are fully dependent, like Brazil nuts, fruits including kiwi and melons, and cocoa beans. A world without pollinators would mean a world without chocolate. With this background, we can better understand the role that these insects play in our food production. We can also navigate the numbers that often hit the headlines on this topic. Many reports, including those from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, quote the figure that 75% of our crops rely on pollinators. It's true, around 3/4, that is 75% of the different crops we grow for food depend on pollinators to some extent. This is based on the number of different crops. But we grow very different amounts of these crops. We harvest much more wheat and rice than strawberries and apples. When we calculate how much of our food production, in tons, comes from pollinator-dependent crops. It's much lower, around 1/3 of our food production, that is 35% relies on pollinators. Our dependence on pollinators will probably grow over time as global diets diversify. As countries get richer, they tend to shift away from staple crops towards fruits, vegetables, nuts, and other nutrient-rich foods. It's also essential to consider not only the amount of food that would be lost, but also the amount of income that could be lost. This is especially true for low-income farmers. Many of the crops that are dependent on pollinators, cocoa, coffee, soybeans, palm oil, avocados, are cash crops that many lower-income countries rely on for trade. A steep decline in pollinators might not see a dramatic change in the world's production of calories, but it could hit some of the world's poorest economically. This leaves us with a delicate balance to navigate. We want to achieve high crop yields. This is not only important for food security and farmer incomes, but also brings important ecological benefits. It means we need less farmland, and we can spare habitat for wildlife. If you like our contents, please hit the bell icon and subscribe to our channel.